Hey guys, tonight we're stepping back to the late 1970s into the private world of David Bowie, a moment caught between fame and disappearance when one quiet interview revealed more than any performance ever could. You'll hear what it meant to live behind the mask of Ziggy Stardust and to face the cost of being both legend and man. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you truly enjoy what you're listening to. And tell me in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see where everyone's listening from around the world. Now, take a breath, settle in, maybe dim the lights, and let's begin. The story starts with sound, or rather the absence of it. Somewhere in a basement in London, or maybe New York, or perhaps Berlin, there's a tape that shouldn't exist anymore. People talk about it the way they talk about ghosts, half believing, half inventing, fully obsessed. They call it the interview Bowie buried, the one he demanded never see light, the one that reveals too much. Except here's the thing, there isn't just one lost interview, there are dozens, maybe hundreds. The phrase, lost Bowie interview, has been passed around fan circles since the early 1980s, whispered like a password to a secret club. Sometimes it refers to real missing reels, actual cassettes that vanished during studio moves or label bankruptcies. Sometimes it means damaged tapes, the magnetic oxide flaking off like skin. And sometimes, if you're being honest, it means nothing at all, just the collective wish that somewhere out there, Bowie said something true. The legend grows because Bowie himself was so good at controlling what you heard. Every public appearance was theatre. Every answer was a performance inside a performance. He'd give you his thoughts on art, mortality, fame, but always through a layer of frost. You'd walk away feeling like you'd learned something profound, then realise later you couldn't remember a single concrete thing he'd said. Paul Dunoyer, a British music journalist, conducted an interview with Bowie in 1989 that was never published in its original form. It sat in Dunoyer's archive for years, transcribed but dormant. When fragments finally surfaced online decades later, fans treated it like archaeological evidence. They passed every sentence for hidden meaning. The tone was reflective, unguarded, or at least less guarded than usual. Bowie talked about fear, about the exhaustion of reinvention, about wondering if any version of himself was real. There's something eerie about hearing a dead man's voice for the first time, not watching footage. That feels expected, archived, official. But voice alone, especially on cassette or reel-to-reel, has a different quality. It's intimate in a way video isn't. You hear the breath between words, the slight rasp, the moments where he's thinking, not performing, or maybe still performing, but in a key so subtle you can't tell the difference. When Bowie died in January 2016, interest in unreleased interviews exploded. Fans scoured archives, contacted old radio DJs, digitized private collections. They were looking for something. Not just more Bowie, but the Bowie, the unedited version. The one who wasn't Ziggy or the Thin White Duke or the Goblin King, but just David Jones from Brixton, tired and human and willing to admit it. Vinnie Seltzer, a New York radio personality, aired what he called the Lost Interview in 1993 on his show Idiot's Delight. It was recorded around the time of Black Tie White Noise, Bowie's return after years of commercial misfires. The conversation was long, rambling, almost meditative. Bowie spoke about race, isolation, the terror of repeating yourself artistically. Seltzer claimed they talked for over 2 hours, much of it off mic, just two people in a studio at night. The original reel was thought lost for years. Then someone uploaded it to SoundCloud. Then someone else made a transcript. Then someone else made a video with still photos. The interview became a kind of digital palimpsest, each version slightly different. Memories and recordings layered over each other until the original became theoretical. Here's what makes the myth work. Bowie's entire career was about what's missing. The gaps between personas, the silence after a reinvention, the way he'd disappear for years and return as someone new, leaving the old version behind like a snakeskin. His mythology doesn't just survive on what he gave us, it thrives on what he withheld. He understood something fundamental about fame. Mystery is more powerful than revelation. Every time he refused to explain himself, the audience invented explanations. Every time he contradicted a previous statement, both versions became true simultaneously. He was Schrödinger's rock star, existing in multiple states until observed, and even then never quite collapsing into one definitive form. So when people talk about the interview they never wanted released, the question becomes, who's they? The record label, management, the BBC? Or Bowie himself curating his own mythology with the precision of a museum archivist deciding what gets displayed and what stays in the vault? After his death, people started finding things. A college radio interview from 1971 surfaced on someone's blog. A TV appearance from 1973 was uploaded by a Swedish broadcaster. Each discovery felt orchestrated somehow, as if Bowie had planted these fragments like time capsules, set to detonate at specific intervals after his death. The man who spent his life controlling his image had found a way to control his afterlife too. The truth is messier and more mundane. Most lost interviews weren't suppressed. They were just forgotten. Tapes sat in storage facilities. Archives got sold off during corporate mergers. Radio stations dumped their old reels to save space. The digital age has been a kind of resurrection, but it's uneven, chaotic, dependent on who bothered to preserve what. But facts don't matter much when you're building a legend. Bowie knew that. He'd been building his own since 1972, when he told Melody Maker he was gay and bisexual and from space, depending on which part of the interview you read. The myth started then, the idea that somewhere in Bowie's carefully constructed public face, there was a secret truth waiting to be excavated. Maybe there was, or maybe the performance was the truth, and we've been looking for something that never existed, a stable centre in a man who made his career out of instability. A confession from someone whose art was built on misdirection. The lost interview, singular, mythical, definitive, probably doesn't exist, but the lost interviews, plural, scattered, fragmentary, absolutely do. They're on YouTube, SoundCloud, in private collections, on decaying magnetic tape in someone's attic. They're being digitised right now, or not, depending on whether anyone thinks they're worth saving. And maybe that's the real story. Not one suppressed truth, but 1,000 small truths, fractured and spread across decades, waiting for someone to piece them together into something that feels whole. Bowie gave us the fragments. We're the ones who can't stop trying to complete the picture. Was anything truly lost? Or did Bowie make sure it was found exactly when he wanted? The question assumes intention where there might only be accident. It assumes control where there might only be chaos. But it's a better story this way, isn't it? The idea that even in death, he's still directing the performance, still deciding what you hear and when, still, somehow, in control. The tape hisses, someone presses play, and somewhere, in the space between what was said and what was recorded, between what was recorded and what survived, between what survived and what we remember. That's where Bowie lives now, in the gaps, where he always preferred to be. London, 1972. Haddon Hall in Beckenham, a Victorian mansion slowly decomposing under the weight of too many musicians and not enough heat. Journalists filed in like anthropologists visiting an alien landing site, notebooks ready, trying to figure out what exactly they were looking at. David Bowie, or the thing calling itself David Bowie, sat in the middle of the chaos wearing platform boots, and an expression somewhere between amusement and exhaustion. He'd spent the morning becoming someone new, hair dyed and sculpted, makeup applied with the precision of war paint. This wasn't a man preparing for an interview. This was a costume change between acts of a play that would run for 18 months and nearly kill him. Michael Watts from Melody Maker came to write a profile. He left with a detonation. In the January 1972 issue, Bowie declared himself gay, or bisexual, depending on how you passed the quote, which people would spend decades doing. "I'm gay," he said, "and always have been, even when I was David Jones." Except he was married to a woman. Except he'd later say he was just bored and wanted attention. Except none of that mattered because the statement was out, and you can't unring that bell. The interview became mythical not because of what Bowie revealed, but because of what he demonstrated. That revelation itself could be performance. That you could tell the truth and lie simultaneously if you delivered it with enough conviction. The tabloids didn't know what to do with him. Was this a confession or a publicity stunt? Was he a pioneer or a provocateur? Bowie later admitted it was partly calculated. He needed attention. Ziggy Stardust and the Spiders from Mars was about to launch, and no one was paying attention yet. A little controversy would help, but he also expressed genuine discomfort at how the moment was distorted, weaponized, turned into something he didn't entirely recognise. Early BBC interviews from this period have gaps, segments that were filmed but never aired, or aired once and then disappeared. Granada Television has reels with missing sections, casualties of reuse and storage costs. In the 1970s, videotape was expensive. You recorded over things. Preservation wasn't the priority. Broadcasting was. So entire conversations with Bowie vanished, wiped clean for the next programme. Journalists who met him during the Ziggy era recall his tension with the press. He'd answer questions, but always at an angle. He'd give you something true, then immediately undercut it with something false, leaving you unsure which was which. He alternated between brutal honesty and elaborate fiction, sometimes within the same sentence. Some reporters noted that Bowie refused to speak as David during this period. He'd only answer in character. If you asked about his childhood, Ziggy would tell you about arriving from space. If you asked about his marriage, Ziggy would explain that earthly relationships didn't apply to him. It was maddening for journalists trained to extract facts. They'd leave with notebooks full of quotes that sounded profound but meant nothing concrete. This attitude, this insistence on speaking only through masks, is where the idea of the censored Bowie tape was born. If he wouldn't speak directly, then surely somewhere there must be a moment where the mask slipped. A recording where he forgot to perform, evidence of the real David Jones underneath all the costumes. Fans and journalists alike became obsessed with this idea. They listened to interviews for cracks in the facade. They analysed tone, cadence, word choice. They convinced themselves they could hear the real him beneath the performance, if they just listened hard enough. But here's the problem with that approach. What if the performance was real? What if there was no David Jones anymore, or there never had been? What if the mask was the face? Bowie gave a radio interview in late 1972 where the host asked him directly, "Who are you when you're alone?" There was a pause, longer than comfortable. Then Bowie laughed, but it wasn't a happy sound. "I'm not sure I'm ever alone," he said. "There's always someone watching, even if it's just me." The comment got cut from the broadcast. Too strange, too uncomfortable. It showed up years later in a bootleg transcript, and fans treated it like a Rosetta Stone. Proof that Bowie was aware of his own dissolution, that the personas weren't costumes he put on, they were the only thing holding him together. But the transcript might be wrong. Memory is unreliable. Bootlegs are worse. Did he really say that? Or did someone remember him saying something like that, and over time it became that? The line is too perfect, too precisely what people wanted him to say. It reads like something from a script. This is the central problem with Bowie's early interviews. They're contaminated by myth. People misremember, misquote, recontextualize. The truth becomes a collaborative fiction, something Bowie started and his audience finished. He encouraged this. During press conferences, he'd give different answers to the same question depending on who asked. Melody Maker got one version of his childhood. NME got another. Both versions couldn't be true, but both were published as fact. Bowie was teaching his audience an uncomfortable lesson. Everything is performance, even autobiography. The mask became protection. As Ziggy's fame grew, Bowie became less and less comfortable being David Jones. Jones was fragile, uncertain, prone to anxiety and depression. Ziggy was bulletproof. Ziggy could walk into a room full of strangers and own it. Ziggy could handle fame in a way Jones never could. But sometimes in interviews you'd see the strain, a moment where his expression would shift, the performance would flicker, and something raw would show through. Those moments never made it to broadcast. They were too human, too uncomfortable. The BBC wanted Bowie the spectacle, not Jones the person. One journalist from this era, interviewed herself decades later, recalled Bowie stopping mid-sentence during a 1973 interview. They'd been talking about America, about taking Ziggy on tour, and suddenly he just stopped. Looked at her like he'd forgotten where he was. "Do you ever feel like you're disappearing?" he asked. Not as Ziggy, as David. She didn't know what to say. The tape kept running. Then he blinked, and Ziggy was back, and the moment was gone. She checked the footage later. That section was missing. Technical error, the editor said. Happens all the time. But she never quite believed it. Maybe it was a technical error. Maybe someone at the network decided it was too strange, too fragile, too real. Or maybe Bowie himself requested it be cut. He had that kind of control even then, when he was still new. He understood what could be shown and what couldn't. The mask was protection. But sometimes he spoke through the cracks, and those moments, brief, unguarded, quickly covered, are what people still search for in the archives. Proof that beneath the alien and the spectacle there was a person. Scared, brilliant, and very human, even if he spent the rest of his life making sure you'd never quite see it. By 1974, something had gone wrong. Bowie was in America, and America was eating him alive. The tour for Diamond Dogs had turned into a cocaine-fueled nightmare of paranoia, sleeplessness, and a growing conviction that nothing was real anymore. Not the audiences, not the music, not himself. The BBC sent a crew to document it. They called the resulting film Cracked Actor, and it remains one of the most unsettling pieces of rock documentary ever made. Not because it shows scandal or excess, but because it shows dissolution. A man coming apart in real time, on camera, too exhausted to maintain the performance. There's a scene in Cracked Actor that people return to obsessively. Bowie in the back of a limousine, drinking milk straight from the carton, smoking incessantly, talking about Hitler and Crowley and the occult with the manic intensity of someone who hasn't slept in days. His eyes are hollow. His skin looks like paper. He's explaining his theory that rock stars are the new gods, that fame is a form of possession, and you can't tell if he believes it or if he's just saying words to fill the silence. "I've had a little problem with reality," he says at one point, and it's unclear whether he's joking. The documentary was supposed to showcase the Diamond Dogs tour, the elaborate stage design, the theatrical ambition, the spectacle. Instead, it captured something much darker and more human. It showed what fame actually does to a person when the mask stops fitting. Bowie hated it. Not immediately. At first, he was too scattered to care. But later, when he'd sobered up enough to watch it properly, he was horrified. This wasn't the controlled revelation of the Ziggy years. This was raw, messy, uncomfortably real. He looked like a junkie. He looked like someone dying. He tried to limit how the documentary was distributed. For years, it was nearly impossible to find. It would air once on BBC, then disappear. Underground copies circulated among fans, but the quality was terrible. Third-generation VHS dubs. The image degraded to the point where Bowie looked like a ghost of a ghost. It became another entry in the mythology of lost Bowie material. Except this time, it wasn't lost due to corporate negligence or tape degradation. Bowie himself had tried to bury it. He'd given permission for its creation, then spent years trying to control its afterlife. The LA period, 1974 through 1975, produced other disappeared interviews, radio sessions that were recorded but never broadcast, TV appearances that were filmed then shelved. Bowie was doing press constantly, but much of it was unusable. He was too high, too paranoid, too strange. He'd go off on tangents about UFOs and fascism and the end of civilization. Producers would smile politely and never air the footage. Some of those tapes still exist. They turn up occasionally in archives or private collections. Bowie ranting about surveillance, about being watched, about not being able to trust his own thoughts. It's difficult to watch. Not because it's scandalous, but because it's sad. You're watching someone brilliant and talented and deeply unwell, surrounded by people who are either enabling him or too scared to intervene. He began banning certain interviewers during this period. Anyone who pressed too hard, who asked uncomfortable questions about his drug use or mental state, would find themselves shut out. His management maintained a list. If you made Bowie uncomfortable, you didn't get access. Simple as that. There are rumours of a particularly brutal interview from late 1975, conducted by a journalist whose name has been lost to time. Supposedly, she asked Bowie point-blank if he wanted to die. According to the story, he stared at her for a long moment, then said, "I think I already have." The tape was confiscated by his management. The interview never ran. The journalist never worked in music journalism again. It's a great story. Too great, probably. The details are too perfect, too precisely calibrated to feed the mythology. But people believe it because it feels true. It sounds like something that could have happened during those years when Bowie was barely holding on. His alienation extended beyond journalists. He was fighting with RCA, his record label, about creative control and money. He was fighting with his manager about touring. He was fighting with his own reflection, which he claimed sometimes moved independently. That last part sounds like psychosis, and it probably was. Cocaine and sleep deprivation will do that, blur the line between self and other, until you're not sure which side of the mirror you're on. Several taped sessions from LA radio stations vanished or were withheld at his request during this time. Not because they were scandalous, but because they were too revealing. They showed how fragile he'd become, how the persona of Bowie, the invincible rock god, was barely holding together under the weight of addiction and fame. This is when the legend of an interview too revealing really took hold. Fans and journalists alike became convinced that somewhere in an RCA vault or a radio station archive there was a tape of Bowie completely unguarded. Bowie without the mask. Bowie admitting everything, the fear, the emptiness, the sense that he'd created a monster he could no longer control. Whether that tape exists is almost beside the point. The myth does the same work either way. It provides a focal point for the discomfort everyone felt watching Bowie during these years. The sense that something terrible was happening and no one was stopping it. In a 1975 interview that did air, barely, Bowie made a comment that's been analysed endlessly. "The person you see isn't me," he said. "It's a construct. It's something I built to survive. But now it's surviving me instead." The interviewer tried to follow up, to push him to explain what he meant. But Bowie had already moved on, talking about his next album, his next persona. The moment of vulnerability closed as quickly as it had opened. The mask came back down. This was Bowie's pattern during the mid-70s. Brief flashes of honesty, immediately covered by performance. Confessions that might be true, or might be another layer of fiction. He kept everyone off balance, including himself. By late 1975, even Bowie could see that something had to change. He couldn't keep going like this. The drug use was unsustainable. The paranoia was becoming unmanageable. The gap between who he was and who he was pretending to be had widened to the point where he could no longer cross it convincingly. He started talking about leaving America, about starting over somewhere quieter. Berlin came up in interviews as a possibility, a place where he could disappear, detox, become someone new, or become nothing for a while, which might be even better. But before he left, there were more interviews, more press obligations, more performances of stability he didn't feel. Each one added to the archive of moments where you can see the strain, where the person beneath the persona briefly surfaces before being pulled back under. People study these interviews the way scholars study religious texts, looking for hidden meaning, for the moment where Bowie reveals the truth about himself. But the truth might be simpler and more uncomfortable. There was no stable self to reveal. Bowie had dissolved into his personas, and by 1975 he wasn't sure how to reverse the process. The interviews that got buried from this era weren't suppressed because of scandal. They were suppressed because they showed the cost of fame too clearly. They showed what happens when the myth consumes the person, and that's not good publicity for anyone. Not the artist, not the label, not the industry that depends on the myth remaining intact. So the tapes were quietly set aside. Not destroyed. That would be too final. Just filed away, marked as unusable, left to gather dust in storage facilities. Forgotten, but not quite lost. Waiting for a time when the mythology around Bowie would be strong enough to survive the reality of his fragility. That time came decades later, after his death, when audiences could watch the Cracked Actor documentary without it feeling like exploitation, when distance and context had transformed raw footage of a man falling apart into art, into evidence of survival, since everyone knew he'd eventually escape LA and get clean and remake himself again. But in 1975, no one knew that yet. In 1975, watching Bowie was like watching a car accident in slow motion. You couldn't look away, but you weren't sure you should be watching at all. Berlin, 1976. Bowie arrived like a refugee, which in a way he was, fleeing fame, fleeing America, fleeing the version of himself that had nearly killed him. He rented an apartment in Schöneberg with Iggy Pop, and the two of them tried to figure out what sobriety looked like. It looked quiet. It looked boring. It looked like taking the U-Bahn to buy groceries and no one recognising you. For the first time in years, Bowie could walk down a street without becoming a spectacle. West Berlin in the late 70s didn't care about British rock stars. It had bigger concerns, like being a city divided against itself, surrounded by a wall, existing in a state of permanent Cold War tension. The albums that came from this period, Low Heroes Lodger, were unlike anything he'd done before. They were cold, fragmentary, experimental. More interested in texture than melody, more interested in what wasn't said than what was. They confused his American label and alienated a chunk of his audience. They also might be his best work, but interviews from the Berlin years are rare and strange. Bowie did fewer of them, and when he did, he was deliberately vague. He'd talk about cleansing and stripping away and finding silence, but he wouldn't explain what he meant. He gave the impression of someone recovering from surgery who didn't want to discuss the operation. The British music press found this frustrating. They wanted the Bowie who gave great quotes, who said outrageous things, who performed controversy. Instead, they got someone quieter, more interior, harder to pin down. Some journalists wrote that he'd become boring. Others wrote that he'd become pretentious. Both groups missed the point. He'd become private. Interviews were archived poorly during this period, partly because of technical limitations and partly because no one thought they'd be historically important. Radio stations in Europe had even less storage than their British counterparts. Tapes were reused or simply discarded. Entire conversations with Bowie disappeared because someone needed the reel for something else, but a few fragments survive. In a 1977 interview that resurfaced years later, Bowie spoke about his time in LA with unusual candour. "I had to cleanse myself of the character I'd become," he said. "Not Ziggy, that was easy to leave behind, but the person who created Ziggy, who needed that kind of escape. I had to figure out how to exist without the mask." The interviewer asked if he'd succeeded. Bowie paused. "I don't know yet," he said. "I'm not sure you can go back once you've been that far gone." This quote appeared in an issue of Uncut magazine decades after the interview was conducted, discovered in someone's personal archive. It became another piece of the puzzle, evidence that Bowie was aware of how close he'd come to complete dissolution in LA. But there are rumours of material that's even more revealing. Stories of a confession tape recorded privately for a European journalist, someone Bowie trusted, someone who promised the conversation was for a book that would be published after his death. According to the legend, Bowie spoke for hours about his addiction, his sexuality, his fear that he'd destroyed something essential in himself. The journalist supposedly kept the tape locked in a safe deposit box. After Bowie's death in 2016, fans waited for it to surface. Nothing came. Some believe it never existed. Others believe the journalist decided to honour Bowie's privacy even in death. Still others believe Bowie's estate paid to keep it buried. It's impossible to verify any of this. No journalist has ever come forward to claim ownership of such a tape. No estate representative has acknowledged its existence. But the story persists because it fits perfectly with the Berlin mythology. The idea that this was when Bowie finally told the truth about himself, but only in private, only off the record. What's documented is that Bowie gave fewer interviews during these years and controlled them more tightly when he did. He'd approve questions in advance. He'd insist on reviewing transcripts before publication. He'd sometimes rewrite his own quotes entirely, turning spontaneous responses into carefully crafted statements. Journalists complained about this, but they went along with it because access to Bowie was valuable. If you didn't play by his rules, you didn't get the interview. So they'd submit their questions, wait for approval, conduct the conversation within the boundaries he'd established, then watch him reshape his words before publication. This level of control meant that every interview from the Berlin period is, to some degree, a performance. Not in the theatrical way of the Ziggy years, but in the sense of being carefully curated. Bowie was deciding what version of himself to present, what level of honesty was safe, what image he wanted to project. Some of his comments from this time are cryptic to the point of meaninglessness. He'd talk about exorcising demons and confronting the self, but never specify what that meant practically. He'd reference Jung and Burroughs and art theory, using language that sounded profound but resisted concrete interpretation. A few interviewers pushed back, trying to get him to speak more plainly. One French journalist asked him directly, "You use many words about transformation and cleansing, but what did you actually do? How did you stop using cocaine?" Bowie's answer, according to the published transcript: "I walked, I looked at paintings, I wrote music that had nothing to do with being a rock star. I tried to remember what it felt like to be interested in things rather than just being interesting." It's a beautiful answer. It's also evasive. It tells you nothing concrete about the process of getting clean, about withdrawal, about rebuilding a life. It's another layer of myth-making, packaging recovery as an aesthetic choice rather than a brutal, physical, mundane struggle. But maybe that was the only way Bowie could talk about it. Maybe direct honesty about addiction and mental illness felt too exposing, too raw. The metaphorical language gave him distance. It let him discuss the experience without fully reliving it. His increasing use of code-like speech frustrated some journalists but fascinated others. They'd spend hours analysing his answers, trying to decode what he really meant. This created another layer of mythology, the idea that Bowie was speaking in symbols, leaving clues for those smart enough to decipher them. Some claimed he was deliberately creating a secret language, a way of communicating with his audience that bypassed mainstream interpretation. Others thought he was just being pretentious, using big words to avoid saying anything real. Both interpretations missed the possibility that Bowie simply didn't know how to articulate what he'd been through, so he reached for whatever language felt adequate. Art theory and psychology and mysticism at least tried to address transformation and dissolution. Everyday language didn't. There are stories from this period of journalists who claim Bowie recorded on the record off-the-record tapes, conversations that were part interview, part therapy session, part performance art. He'd allegedly suggest that they keep two versions, one for publication and one for the archive. The public version would be safe, controlled, marketable. The private version would be whatever actually happened in the room. Whether any of these private tapes exist is unknown. If they do, they've never surfaced. But the idea of them adds another dimension to the Berlin mythology. The notion that somewhere there's a version of Bowie from this period who's completely unguarded, speaking without performance, admitting to things he'd never say publicly. It's a comforting idea for fans who want to believe there was a real Bowie beneath all the construction. But it might also be wishful thinking. Maybe there was no unguarded version. Maybe by this point the performance had become so integral that removing it would leave nothing behind. What's certain is that the Berlin years marked a shift in how Bowie managed his public image. He became more reclusive, more selective, more willing to say no to press opportunities. He was rebuilding himself, and he didn't want cameras documenting the process. The interviews that do exist from this period show someone thoughtful, sober, and deeply tired. The manic energy of the Ziggy years is gone. So is the paranoid fragility of LA. What remains is someone trying to figure out who he is when he's not trying to be anyone at all. In a 1978 interview conducted near the end of his time in Berlin, Bowie said something that didn't make it into the final published piece, but survived in the journalist's notes. "I think I became a better artist when I stopped trying to be David Bowie. The problem is, I'm not sure who's left when you take that away." It's a haunting comment. It suggests that even after 2 years of recovery and reinvention, he still wasn't sure there was a stable self underneath. The Berlin period wasn't about finding himself, it was about learning to live with the absence of that certainty. The interviews were part of that process. Each one was Bowie testing out a new way of presenting himself, trying on different levels of honesty, seeing what felt sustainable. Some worked, some didn't. The ones that didn't were quietly buried, added to the growing archive of material that was too revealing or too strange or too human. The Berlin years became, in the mythology, Bowie's purification through absence, a retreat from the world, a period of silence, a cocoon from which he'd eventually emerge transformed. But the reality was messier. He was still giving interviews, still managing his image, still performing versions of himself. The performance had just become quieter, more subtle, harder to detect. And the material that documented that quieter performance, the interviews where you could hear him thinking, struggling, trying to articulate something he couldn't quite name, that material largely disappeared. Not through conspiracy, but through the mundane realities of archival neglect. The Berlin exile ended in 1979. Bowie left the city, moved to New York, prepared for his next reinvention. But the mythology of those years remained. The idea that Berlin was where he'd been most honest, most vulnerable, most himself. Whether that was true or just another layer of performance depends on which interviews you believe, and which ones you can still find. By 1983, Bowie had become something he'd never quite been before, a genuine mainstream pop star. Let's Dance was everywhere, MTV, radio, arenas. The music was slick, accessible, commercially brilliant. It made him wealthier and more famous than the Ziggy years ever had. It also made him miserable in ways that took years to articulate. The interviews from this period are strange in their blandness. Bowie sitting in hotel rooms, answering the same questions about the same album, smiling in the right places, saying absolutely nothing meaningful. He'd become a product, and products don't reveal themselves. They stay on message. The press lapped it up initially. Here was Bowie, finally giving straight answers, finally being professional, finally playing the game properly. No more cryptic pronouncements or artistic pretension. Just a rock star talking about his rock star life in rock star language. But if you watch these interviews carefully, you can see something else. A flatness in his eyes. A slight delay before he answers, like he's translating his thoughts into acceptable PR speak. The performance has become so smooth it's almost frictionless. There's nothing to grab onto, nothing that feels real. Privately, he was starting to hate it. The music, the tours, the version of himself he'd created. He'd escaped the drug-addicted persona of LA and the experimental austerity of Berlin, only to trap himself in something arguably worse. Corporate blandness. At least the earlier versions had been interesting. The MTV interviews are particularly surreal. Bowie surrounded by neon and smoke machines, giving one-sentence answers to questions about fashion and touring. He looks like a wax figure of himself. Perfect hair, perfect suit, perfect smile. Nothing beneath the surface except more surface. But occasionally something would slip through. A 1984 interview where he's asked about his legacy, and he responds, "I became the thing I was warning about." The interviewer doesn't follow up, doesn't understand what he means. The moment passes. But fans have returned to that clip obsessively, trying to decode what he was really saying. Was he talking about fame? Commercialization? The way art gets absorbed and neutered by capitalism? Or was it more personal, an admission that he'd become a product of his own mythology, unable to escape the character he'd created? Lost material from MTV interviews surfaces occasionally. Early satellite feeds that were recorded but never broadcast. Behind-the-scenes footage from video shoots. Most of it is mundane. Bowie being professional, charming, empty. But fans comb through it anyway, looking for the moment where the mask slips. The 1987 Glass Spider tour was supposed to be a triumphant spectacle. Instead, critics savaged it. Too theatrical, too pretentious, too disconnected from the music. Bowie tried to defend it in interviews, explaining his vision, his concept, his artistic intentions. The more he explained, the worse it sounded. The press started openly mocking him. There's footage from a press conference during this period where you can watch him realise in real time that he's lost the room. He's trying to talk about narrative structure and visual storytelling, and the journalists are barely listening. They want sound bites about Madonna or Michael Jackson. They want gossip, not art theory. He stops mid-sentence, looks around, laughs quietly to himself. "You know what?" he says. "Never mind." Then he pivots to talking about the production budget instead. Safer ground, measurable ground, ground that doesn't require defending artistic choices no one wants to hear about. That press conference was recorded, but the full version has never been officially released. The few minutes that aired were edited to remove the awkward moments, the false starts, the visible frustration. What remains is a sanitized version of Bowie being professional. What's buried is Bowie realizing he'd become irrelevant in a way that fame couldn't protect him from. The 1988 interview for the Sound Plus Vision exhibit is another lost piece. Bowie was preparing for a greatest hits tour, announcing it would be his last time performing the old songs. He wanted to move forward, to stop being trapped by nostalgia. The interview was supposed to document this decision, his reasoning, his plans for the future. According to people who saw the footage before it was withdrawn, Bowie was unusually candid. He talked about feeling like a tribute act to himself, about performing Ziggy Stardust songs and feeling nothing, because the person who wrote those songs didn't exist anymore, about the exhaustion of being expected to embody multiple contradictory personas simultaneously. The tape vanished before the exhibit opened. Officially, it was a technical issue. Unofficially, someone, possibly Bowie, possibly his management, possibly the exhibit organisers, decided it was too bleak. It didn't fit the celebration narrative. A greatest hits tour should feel triumphant, not like a funeral. This is when Bowie the mythmaker truly began redacting his own past. Not just controlling new interviews, but going back through the archive, deciding what could be seen and what needed to remain hidden. It wasn't censorship in the traditional sense, it was curation. He was building the version of his history he wanted to exist. The corporate Bowie period is the least interesting to fans and scholars alike. The music is fine, but forgettable. The performances are professional, but soulless. The interviews reveal nothing except that Bowie had become very good at not revealing things. But beneath that carefully maintained surface, something else was happening. Bowie was starting to understand that he'd made a mistake, that mainstream success wasn't worth the cost of artistic compromise, that being beloved by everyone meant being meaningful to no one. He started giving strange, oblique answers in interviews again. Not the cryptic art speak of the Berlin years, but something else. Philosophical musings on identity, technology, the future of culture. The interviewers didn't know what to do with it. They'd ask about his next album, and he'd talk about the internet. They'd ask about touring, and he'd talk about the death of authorship. In a 1989 interview, he said something that's been quoted endlessly since. "I'm not interested in being David Bowie anymore, but I don't know how to stop." The interviewer tried to turn it into a joke, to lighten the mood. Bowie didn't laugh, he just looked tired. These moments accumulate through the late 80s, small admissions of dissatisfaction, quickly papered over with professionalism. The archive from this period is full of interviews that start interestingly, then peter out into standard promotional material. You can feel Bowie catch himself, remember he's supposed to be selling something, and pull back. Some of these partial revelations made it to air, others didn't. The ones that didn't are the ones fans obsess over. The interviews where Bowie seemed on the verge of saying something real before the machine shut him down. By the end of the decade, Bowie was trapped. Too famous to disappear, too compromised to feel good about what he was creating, too professional to publicly admit failure. The interviews reflect this stalemate. He's present, but not there, answering questions, but not saying anything. The mythology of the lost interview from this period isn't about a specific tape. It's about the general sense that the real Bowie, the one who was struggling, disappointed, artistically adrift, never got to speak. That version stayed hidden behind the smooth PR facade, visible only in fragments and silences. Years later, after Bowie had escaped this period and rebuilt himself again, he'd occasionally reference the late 80s with something like embarrassment. Not about the music, though he wasn't proud of it. About the persona. About how successfully he'd hidden his own dissatisfaction, to the point where even he'd almost started believing his own publicity. "I was professionally content," he said in a late 90s interview, which is maybe the most dangerous thing you can be as an artist. It means you've stopped fighting. The tapes from the corporate years vanished not through conspiracy but through irrelevance. No one wanted them. They documented a period most people, including Bowie, preferred to forget. But lately, as the archive has been digitized, they're resurfacing. And what they show is someone practicing an advanced form of disappearance, hiding in plain sight, performing presence while being fundamentally absent. It's a different kind of lost interview, not one that was suppressed for being too revealing, but one that was ignored for revealing nothing at all. And maybe that absence is its own kind of truth. The year is 1993 and Bowie is in a radio studio in New York talking to Vinnie Scelsa. It's late, past midnight. The city outside is quiet in that specific way cities never actually are, but feel like they should be in moments like this. Two people, microphones, darkness pressing against the windows, black tie white noise had just come out. The album was Bowie's attempt at reclaiming something personal after years of commercial compromise. It was about his marriage, about race, about trying to find authenticity in a life built on artifice. The critics were lukewarm, the public was indifferent. But Bowie seemed lighter anyway, like he'd accomplished something just by making it. Seltzer's show, Idiot's Delight, wasn't a typical promotional stop. It was freeform, conversational, the kind of radio that let people talk until they ran out of things to say. No time limits, no handlers, no approved topics, just whatever happened in the moment. The interview lasted over 2 hours. Much of it was on air, but large portions were recorded with the microphones off. Bowie and Seltzer just talking, the tape running in the background, capturing whatever felt too private or too raw for broadcast. Bowie spoke about isolation, not the artistic kind, but the actual human kind. About feeling disconnected from the people around him, even when surrounded by collaborators and friends. About the strangeness of being famous for being himself, except the self everyone recognised wasn't the one he lived with privately. He talked about race in a way he hadn't publicly before. His marriage to Iman, his thoughts on being white in a predominantly black musical tradition, his discomfort with how his own image had been used and misused. It wasn't confessional exactly. Bowie was still too controlled for that, but it was more direct than he'd been in years, and he talked about his fear of artistic repetition, of becoming a parody of himself, of running out of new ideas and being forced to recycle old ones until there was nothing left but nostalgia. "I can't just be Ziggy forever," he said at one point, "but I'm terrified I might not be anything else." The original reel-to-reel sat in Seltzer's archives for years, unlabelled or mislabelled. When Seltzer moved studios, when formats changed, when digital archiving became standard, the tape travelled with him, but its significance was forgotten. It was just another interview from the 90s, unexceptional at the time. Then Bowie died in January 2016, and suddenly everything he'd ever said became precious. Fans started combing through old interviews, digitising private collections, uploading fragments to YouTube and SoundCloud. Someone found the Seltzer interview in the process and uploaded it with the title, The Lost Interview. The designation stuck, not because the interview had been suppressed or hidden, but because it had been forgotten, lost not through conspiracy, but through the mundane reality of analogue media in the pre-digital age. Tapes got set aside, filed incorrectly, buried under newer material. They didn't disappear, they just stopped being accessible. When the interview resurfaced, fans treated it like an archaeological discovery. Here was Bowie, vulnerable and thoughtful, speaking about things he rarely addressed publicly. The conversation meandered the way real conversations do, no agenda, no promotion, just two people talking past midnight. Seltzer later claimed that the full recording was even more revealing. That the off-mic portions, to the parts where they'd turned away from the broadcast but kept the tape running, captured Bowie at his most unguarded, speaking about his childhood, his sexuality, his relationships, his fears about aging and irrelevance. Whether those portions still exist is unclear. Seltzer has mentioned them in interviews but never released them. Either they were lost in subsequent moves, or he's chosen to honour Bowie's privacy even after death. Or maybe they never existed the way memory suggests, and what Seltzer remembers as profound confession was actually just ordinary conversation, significant only in retrospect. This is how the mythology grows. A real interview documented and preserved becomes the foundation for speculation about what else might exist. The actual tape is moving and intimate. But the idea of the fuller tape, the one with even more truth, even more vulnerability, is more powerful than reality. What's documented in the surviving audio is remarkable enough. Bowie sounds tired but present, not performing, or at least performing less than usual. His voice has a different quality than in most interviews from this period, slower, more considered, like he's thinking out loud rather than delivering prepared answers. There's a moment about 40 minutes in where Seltzer asks him about fame, and Bowie pauses for so long it's almost uncomfortable. The silence extends. You can hear him breathing, the hiss of the tape, the distant sound of traffic outside. Finally he says, "I don't know how to answer that honestly without sounding ungrateful or insane." Seltzer doesn't push, they sit with it. Then Bowie continues, "Fame is being recognised everywhere you go. but it's also never being seen. People look at you constantly, but they're seeing the idea of you, not the actual person. So you're simultaneously overexposed and completely invisible, and after a while you start to disappear even from yourself. It's not a revelation in the sense of scandal or hidden truth, but it's honest in a way Bowie rarely allowed himself to be in interviews. The control is lower, the performance is quieter. What remains is closer to the actual person, or at least closer than most of what exists in the archive. The interview circulated on SoundCloud, then YouTube, then dedicated Bowie fan sites. People made transcripts. They analysed specific phrases. They compared this version of Bowie to others from different eras, tracking the evolution of his public persona across decades. Some fans called it the real interview they never wanted released, though of course, no one had tried to suppress it. It was released the first time in 1993 to Seltzer's regular audience. It just hadn't been preserved or promoted beyond that initial broadcast. But the phrase stuck, because it captured something true about the culture's relationship to Bowie. The hunger for the unfiltered version. The belief that somewhere in the archive there's a moment where he drops the mask completely and speaks from a place of total honesty. The 1993 interview feels like that moment. Not because Bowie reveals scandalous secrets, but because he sounds human. Uncertain, thoughtful, grappling with questions he doesn't have answers for. The distance between the persona and the person feels smaller than usual, but it's worth noting that even this interview is still a performance. Bowie knows he's being recorded. He knows this might be broadcast. He's not writing in a private diary or speaking to a therapist. He's still choosing his words, still shaping his image, still constructing a version of himself for public consumption. The construction is just subtler, more naturalistic, closer to improvisation than script, but it's still there. The fragility of the medium adds to the mythology. Analog tape degrades, magnetic particles flake off, recordings become noisy, distorted, eventually unplayable. This interview survived by accident as much as intention. If Seltzer had stored the tape differently, if humidity had been higher, if he'd needed the reel for something else, it might have been lost permanently. And maybe that's the real story of the Lost Bowie interviews. Not that they were censored, but that they were fragile, dependent on specific people, in specific places making specific decisions to preserve them. Most didn't survive those variables. This one did. And that survival feels miraculous only because we know how easily it could have gone the other way. Years later, when Bowie's estate began systematically archiving his work, they included the Seltzer interview in the official catalogue. It's no longer lost in any meaningful sense. You can find it. You can listen to it. The mystery has been resolved. But resolution doesn't quite satisfy. Fans still talk about what else Seltzer might have recorded, what was said off mic. What other late-night interviews might still be buried in someone's archive waiting to resurface? Because the actual truth isn't as compelling as the possibility of truth. A specific interview can be analysed, understood, contextualised. But the idea of a lost interview, one that exists somewhere, unseen, more revealing than anything else, that idea can sustain infinite speculation. Bowie understood this about mythology. That absence creates meaning more effectively than presence. That what you don't say lingers longer than what you do. The 1993 interview is valuable, partly because it exists, but maybe more because it was almost lost. The near absence makes the presence more significant. The truth wasn't censored. It just slipped through time, nearly disappeared, then surfaced exactly when people needed it most. Right after Bowie's death, when the hunger for connection to him was strongest. The timing feels too perfect to be accident, but of course it was. Time is full of accidents that feel like intention when you look at them backward. The tape hisses, the voices continue. Somewhere past midnight in 1993, two people are talking, and the conversation matters more now than it did then. That's how it works with lost things. They gain significance through their almost absence. The interview becomes important not just for what's said, but for the fact that it survived to be heard at all. The late 90s arrived, and with them, something unprecedented. BowieNet. David Bowie launched his own internet service provider in 1998, becoming the first major artist to create a dedicated online portal for fans. email addresses ending in davidbowie.com, chat rooms, message boards, exclusive content. It was ambitious, strange, and very Bowie, simultaneously forward-thinking and slightly absurd. But what made it remarkable wasn't the technology, it was what Bowie chose to do with it. He began releasing fragments of his own archive, old interview clips, demo recordings, behind-the-scenes footage, material that had been locked away or forgotten. He was becoming his own archivist, deciding what deserved preservation and what should remain buried. The control was total. No label oversight, no broadcaster editing choices, just Bowie curating his own history, piece by piece, according to logic only he understood. Sometimes he'd release something significant, an unreleased track from the Berlin years. Sometimes he'd release something mundane, backstage footage of sound checks. The pattern was deliberate in its inconsistency. Fans adapted quickly. Online communities formed dedicated to trading, digitizing, and cataloguing Bowie material. Before streaming, before YouTube, there were fan-run servers with searchable databases of every known interview, performance, and television appearance. They worked like archivists because the official industry wasn't doing it. Tapes circulated through mail chains. Someone would have a recording of a 1973 radio interview on cassette. They'd digitize it to MP3, upload it to a private FTP server, and share the link on BowieNet forums. Others would do the same with their collections. A grassroots preservation network built by people who understood that analog media was dying, and if they didn't act, these recordings would disappear. This was when rumours of specific lost materials became codified. The DB-77 tapes, supposedly recordings from Berlin that Bowie had kept private. The RCA masters, interview reels that had gone missing during corporate mergers. The cracked actor outtakes, additional footage too dark for the original documentary. Some of these rumours had basis in reality. Others were speculation based on gaps in the official record. A few were pure invention, myths that took on weight through repetition, until people forgot they'd started as theories. Bowie seemed amused by the whole thing. In online chats with fans, actual real-time conversations which felt miraculous at the time, he'd make cryptic references to his own archive. He'd hint that yes, certain materials existed. No, he wouldn't say where. Maybe he'd release them someday. Maybe not. The ambiguity was intentional. In a 1999 Rolling Stone interview, he said something that's been quoted constantly since. "I'm fascinated by what I didn't say that people think I did." The comment captured his awareness of his own mythology. That the public version of Bowie was a collaborative fiction, created as much by audience interpretation as his own performance. He began to joke about being my own bootlegger now. Instead of fighting unofficial releases, he was preempting them, releasing material himself before it could leak, taking ownership of his legacy in ways that weren't possible before digital distribution. The internet gave him something he'd never had before, direct access to his audience without industry mediation. No label executives, no radio programmers, no magazine editors deciding what got released and how. Just Bowie and the people who'd followed his work for decades, communicating in real time. But it also created new expectations. Fans wanted everything, every demo, every interview, every scrap of footage. The more he released, the more they wanted. The archive became insatiable. Each revelation prompted questions about what else existed, what else he was holding back. Fan sites began documenting every known recording in obsessive detail. Bootleg trading lists with titles like London 1973, Complete Radio Interview, Partial Audio, or Berlin 1978, TV Appearance, Audio Only, German Commentary. Each entry included technical details, source generation, audio quality, completeness. The level of detail was remarkable. People tracked which versions of which songs were played at which concerts. They noted when Bowie's speaking voice sounded different, identifying eras by tone and cadence alone. They could tell you which interviewers he'd been comfortable with based on response patterns and body language and video footage. This wasn't casual fandom, it was historiography, a distributed effort to document and preserve a cultural figure's complete output, because the official mechanisms weren't doing it adequately. Bowie noticed and seemed genuinely impressed. In online chats, he'd occasionally correct the record. No, that wasn't Berlin 1978, it was actually Munich 1977. the fans would update their databases accordingly. Around this time, specific legends hardened into accepted history. The lost 1977 interview became a specific thing fans referenced, even though no one could agree on what exactly it was. Some said it was a French television appearance, others claimed it was a radio interview in Brussels. A few insisted it was a private conversation with William S. Burroughs that had been recorded but never released. The truth was probably that all these interviews existed in some form, partial recordings, transcripts, memories, but none were lost in the dramatic sense. They were just scattered across time and format, difficult to access, poorly preserved. The mythology made them sound suppressed. The reality was more boring. They'd been archived badly, and no one had bothered to digitize them yet. Bowie seemed to understand that erasure could be a form of authorship. By controlling what remained hidden, he shaped how his public history was understood. Each gap in the archive became significant. Each missing interview turned into speculation about why it was missing. In a 2000 online Q&A, someone asked him directly, "What interview do you most regret?" His answer, "All of them, but also none of them. They're all performances. Some performances work better than others, but none of them are real in the way people want them to be. So regret doesn't quite apply." It was the kind of answer that seemed profound but resisted analysis. Classic Bowie, appearing to reveal something while actually maintaining complete control over what was revealed. The fans analysed it anyway, extracting meaning from every phrase. The digitization effort continued through the early 2000s. Fans with technical expertise taught themselves audio restoration. They'd take degraded cassettes and clean them up using early versions of software like Audacity. They'd remove hiss, boost vocals, sometimes add EQ to make decades-old recordings sound clearer. These restored versions would get shared online with notes. 1974 interview, remastered from original cassette, EQ adjusted, tape hiss reduced. The work was done with archival care, not just fan enthusiasm. People understood they were preserving history. Bowie occasionally acknowledged this work. He'd mention in interviews that fans knew his catalogue better than he did, that they'd preserved material he'd forgotten existed, that their archives were more complete than his own. It was generous of him, and probably true. The online community became its own kind of memory bank, distributed across servers, hard drives, burned CDs. No single person had everything, but collectively the network held more Bowie material than any official archive. It was democratic in a way traditional archiving couldn't be. Thousands of people each preserving what they loved, creating redundancy through duplication. But it also meant that myths could spread as easily as facts. An incorrectly labelled bootleg could be copied and shared until the wrong information became accepted history. Someone's speculation about a lost interview could become treated as documented fact simply through repetition. Bowie watched this happen with fascination. His mythology was mutating online, evolving through collective storytelling. Details were being added, interpretations were hardening into canon, and he had less control over the process than he'd ever had before. Except he did have control in a way, because the gaps he'd deliberately left in his archive shaped how the community filled them in. By refusing to explain certain things, by keeping certain materials private, he'd created space for speculation. The community was performing collective mythology building, but Bowie had written the prompt. In the final BowieNet Q&A before the service shut down in 2006, someone asked, "Do you read the fan sites? Do you know what people think happened?" His response, "I read them occasionally. It's fascinating. Some of what they believe is true, some is completely invented, and I'm not sure even I know which is which anymore. Memory is a collaborative project." It was maybe the most honest thing he'd said about his own mythology, that at this point, decades deep, even he couldn't separate performance from reality, public history from private memory. The archive had become so layered, so interpreted and reinterpreted, that the original truth, if it ever existed as something singular, was irretrievable. The internet had promised transparency. Instead, it created infinite room for myth-making. Every answer prompted more questions. Every release suggested other unreleased material. The more available Bowie's work became, the more the gaps stood out. And Bowie, who'd spent his career understanding how absence creates meaning, recognised what was happening. The digital age hadn't demystified him. It had just given his mystification new tools. Fast forward to 2003. CBS sends a crew to interview David Bowie for 60 minutes. It's supposed to be a comprehensive segment, the kind of mainstream exposure that cements legacy. Bowie at 60, reflective and accomplished, looking back on decades of innovation and reinvention. The interview happens. Mike Wallace asks questions. Bowie answers. They film for hours, covering his career, his art collection, his thoughts on aging and creativity. There's backstage footage at a concert, scenes of him in his New York apartment surrounded by paintings. The whole thing is exactly what you'd expect from a 60 minutes profile of a cultural icon. And then CBS doesn't air it. Not immediately, anyway. The footage sits in their archive for 13 years, through Bowie's final albums, through his retreat from public life, through his illness and death. It finally airs in January 2016, days after he dies, and suddenly it's not just another interview, it's a message from the dead. The reasons for the delay were mundane. Editorial focus shifted. Other stories took priority. The segment got bumped, then forgotten, then filed away. There was no conspiracy, no suppression, just the reality of television production where material gets shelved all the time for reasons having nothing to do with content. But 13 years is a long time, long enough for Bowie to become someone different, long enough for the interview to accumulate unintended meaning. In 2003 it would have been a pleasant retrospective. In 2016 it became a haunted document. Bowie's voice and face, present but absent, speaking from a time when death was distant rather than immediate. The segment that finally aired is remarkably undramatic. Bowie is charming, thoughtful, articulate. He talks about his art collection with genuine enthusiasm. He discusses his career without bitterness or self-aggrandizement. He seems comfortable, settled, content in a way he rarely appeared in earlier decades. There's a moment where Wallace asks about his legacy, and Bowie laughs. "I try not to think about it," he says. "Legacy is what other people decide. I'm just trying to make things that interest me. Whether they matter to anyone else is beyond my control." It's a modest answer, almost dismissive. But it reveals something about how Bowie thought about his work by this point. Not as mythology building, not as career strategy, just as making things and putting them into the world and seeing what happens. The unseen portions, footage that was shot but didn't make the final edit, are reportedly even more interesting. Bowie talking about fear, about the terror of running out of ideas, about what happens when you've been creating publicly for 40 years and the well starts to feel dry. According to the crew, there was an extended conversation about death that was too dark for broadcast. Not Bowie being morbid, but being realistic. He was in his 50s, thinking about mortality, aware that at some point the work would end. He talked about it calmly, like discussing the weather. No drama, just acknowledgement. That footage has never been released. It remains in CBS archives, seen by only a handful of people. Whether it will eventually surface is unknown. Bowie's estate has been careful about what posthumous material gets released. Some things are better left private, even when they're technically public domain. The unaired status created speculation long before his death. Bowie fans knew about the interview. He'd mentioned it in other contexts, but no one could see it. For 13 years, it existed in that liminal space between public and private. Recorded but not broadcast. Known but not accessible. When it finally aired, right after Bowie died, the timing felt deliberate, as if he'd orchestrated it from beyond the grave, as if the delay had been intentional, part of his final performance. The posthumous audience projected intention onto what was probably just scheduling accident. But the effect was real, regardless of intention. Watching Bowie speak in 2016 about creativity and legacy and aging felt unbearably poignant. He was talking about abstract future concerns, unaware that he had only 13 years left. The interview became a time capsule, a document of what he'd been thinking about at 56, before illness, before the final albums, before the end. The posthumous framing changed everything. In 2003, this would have been a standard retrospective. In 2016, every word carried additional weight. When he talked about trying to stay creative, viewers heard it as foreshadowing Black Star. when he mentioned not wanting to repeat himself. It sounded like explanation for his years of silence. The interview became prophetic through nothing more than timing. This is what happens with posthumous material. It gets recontextualized. The person speaking doesn't know what's coming, but the audience does. So every statement becomes double-coded. What it meant when it was said, and what it means now that the speaker is gone. CBS called the delayed broadcast the interview they didn't want released in promotional material. But who was they? The network that shelved it? Bowie himself, though there's no evidence he requested it be held. The phrase was marketing, capitalizing on the mythology of a lost Bowie material, even though this wasn't lost so much as misfiled. The actual content is remarkably straightforward. Bowie as philosopher-artist, thoughtful but not pretentious, talking about buying paintings instead of cars, about raising his daughter away from spotlight, about finding satisfaction in work rather than recognition. There's very little about the chaos of his early career, nothing about drug use or personas or the machinery of fame. By 2003, he'd left all that behind, or at least, he'd processed it to the point where it didn't need constant discussion. The interview is less about explaining himself than simply presenting who he'd become, which made it powerful in a different way. This wasn't Ziggy or the Thin White Duke. This was David Jones at 56, comfortable enough to just be himself without the armour of performance, or comfortable enough to make being himself the performance, which might amount to the same thing. The posthumous audience searched the footage for hidden meaning. Did he know he was ill? Was there subtext in his comments about legacy? Were certain pauses significant? Frame-by-frame analysis began immediately, people looking for clues that probably weren't there. Because that's what we do with the dead. We make them oracular. We assume their final statements carry special weight, as if dying gives you access to truth you couldn't articulate while living. But Bowie in 2003 didn't know anything the rest of us didn't. He was just older, more experienced, better at articulating his thoughts after decades of being interviewed. Still, watching it after his death created genuine emotional impact. His face, his voice, his particular way of pausing before answering. All of it suddenly precious because it was finite. The interview became less about information and more about presence. Proof that he'd existed, thought things, shared them. The recontextualization worked in Bowie's favour mythologically. It made him seem prescient, in control even of how his posthumous image would be managed. The 13-year delay looked like strategy rather than accident. The timing looked orchestrated rather than coincidental. Maybe it was. Maybe Bowie requested it be held, knowing it would mean more later. Or maybe CBS just forgot about it, and the universe occasionally produces timing that feels too perfect to be random. Both explanations are satisfying in different ways. What's certain is that Bowie's greatest interviews waited until he was gone. Not because he planned it that way necessarily, but because death transforms meaning. The same words, spoken by someone living versus someone dead, carry completely different weight. Context is everything, and death is the ultimate context shift. The 2003 60 Minutes interview proved that. It was fine when filmed. It became extraordinary through absence and return. The delay gave it power it wouldn't have otherwise had. And whether that was Bowie's final performance or just accident elevated to art depends on how much intention you want to attribute to someone who spent his life blurring that line. January 10th, 2016. David Bowie releases Black Star, his 28th and final studio album. The music is dark, jazzy, experimental. The videos are cryptic and death-haunted. Critics call it a return to form. No one knows he's dying. January 11th, 2016. David Bowie dies. Cancer. 18 months of treatment kept private. A death that took the world by surprise because he'd hidden the illness so completely. The album suddenly transforms from artistic statement to farewell letter. Every lyric becomes prophetic. Every image becomes about mortality. The timing is devastating and perfect. He'd released a masterpiece, given the world 2 days to react to it as art, then revealed it was also goodbye. The control was total, even in dying. He'd shaped his death as carefully as he'd shaped his life, turning it into his final performance. Then, days later, CBS airs the 2003 interview, the one that had been shelved for 13 years, and the uncanniness multiplies. Here's Bowie. Younger and healthy, talking about legacy and aging, speaking from a time when death was theoretical rather than immediate. The contrast with Blackstar is overwhelming. Fans who'd followed him for decades found themselves mourning in a strange new way. Not just the loss of a person, but the loss of someone who'd been actively mythologizing himself until the end. Someone who'd treated death itself as material to be shaped and presented. The term, the lost interview, resurfaced across fan forums and press immediately. Not referring to anything specific at first, just capturing the collective feeling that somewhere in Bowie's massive archive, there must be a recording that explained everything. A moment where he dropped the mask completely and spoke with total clarity about who he'd been and what it all meant. Of course, no such interview existed, or rather every interview existed in this way and none did. Because Bowie had spent 5 decades constructing a persona that resisted singular interpretation. There was no decoder ring, no master explanation, just layers of performance and authenticity so intertwined they'd become inseparable. But people searched anyway. They combed through decades of footage looking for hidden meaning. A comment from 1978 that predicted his later work. A pause in a 1993 interview that suggested foreknowledge of mortality. Frame-by-frame analysis of music videos for visual clues about what he'd been planning. It was magical thinking, mostly. The assumption that death would somehow make his archive legible, in ways it hadn't been during life. That the end would illuminate the beginning, revealing patterns that had been invisible before. Some patterns did emerge. Themes of transformation and death had run through his work since the beginning. The personas themselves were a form of dying, killing one version of himself to birth another. Blackstar wasn't new thematically. It just made everything that came before feel inevitably pointed toward this ending. His death recontextualized his whole archive. Suddenly, silence became meaningful. The years between albums weren't breaks. They were deliberate absences. The private decade of the 2000s wasn't retreat. It was preparation for a final statement. Whether Bowie actually planned it this way is unknowable, but the mythology formed around the idea that he did. That his entire career had been orchestrated, each move calculated, each silence strategic. It made a better story than the alternative, that he'd made it up as he went along like everyone else, and the patterns emerged through accident more than design. Small interviews from the 70s resurfaced. College radio conversations that had been uploaded to YouTube years earlier suddenly got millions of views. Every fragment of his voice became precious. People made playlists of interview excerpts, stitching together quotes from across decades into new forms of meaning. A 1997 interview where he talked about art and impermanence circulated widely. "Nothing lasts," he'd said. "You make the work, you put it out there, and eventually it fades. That's fine. That's what's supposed to happen." Taken out of context, in the days after his death, the quote sounded like acceptance of mortality. In context, he'd been talking about avoiding legacy obsession. But context didn't matter anymore. The archive had become a choose-your-own-adventure of meaning. You could construct whatever version of Bowie you needed by selecting the right quotes, the right images, the right moments. The mythology was fully collaborative now, built as much by audience interpretation as by anything he'd actually said or done. Fans dug through bootleg trading sites looking for recordings they'd never heard. Radio shows from the 80s that existed only on cassette. Television appearances that had never been digitized. The hunt for new material intensified, driven by the finality of his death. This was it. No more interviews, no more statements. Whatever existed in the archive was all there would ever be. Each rediscovered clip fueled the sense of divine timing. A German TV interview from 1978 surfaced a week after his death. A radio conversation from 1993 that had been uploaded to SoundCloud years earlier suddenly became widely known. The archive seemed to be revealing itself gradually, pieces emerging exactly when they were needed. This fed into the mythology that Bowie had orchestrated everything, that these fragments were planned releases, timed capsules set to go off at specific intervals after his death. The truth was more mundane. Digitization was an ongoing process, people kept finding things, and social media allowed rapid distribution. but the mythology was more compelling. Some of the resurfaced material was profound, some was mundane. The desperate search for meaning led people to treat everything as significant. A throwaway comment from a 1981 radio interview became analysed for hidden depth. A pause before answering a question became evidence of some deeper awareness. The hunger for connection was understandable. Death creates absence, and humans fill absence with meaning. The archive became a way to maintain relationship with someone who no longer existed. By listening to his voice, watching his face, passing his words, fans could momentarily forget the finality of his absence. But the search also revealed how much was actually missing. How many recordings had been lost to time, format obsolescence, archival neglect? How many conversations had happened without cameras or microphones present? How much of Bowie's life and thought would never be accessible because it had never been documented? The gaps in the archive became as significant as what remained. Each missing interview represented a version of Bowie no one would ever access. Each lost recording was a road not taken, a perspective forever unavailable. The mythology of the lost interview, singular, definitive, explaining everything, grew from this awareness of absence. People began to theorize what that interview would contain. Full disclosure about his sexuality, honest discussion of drug use and recovery, explanation of what each persona meant, reflection on mistakes and regrets, a comprehensive autobiography in conversation form. But this interview, if it existed, would probably be disappointing, because Bowie had spent his life resisting singular explanations. The real lost interview, the one that would satisfy everyone's hunger for truth, couldn't exist, because it would contradict the fundamental principle of his work, that identity is multiple, fluid, performed, that there's no core self to reveal, just versions in conversation with each other. His death didn't resolve this, it intensified it. The absence made the desire for presence more acute, and so the search continued. Fans combing through archives, enhancing audio, restoring video, trying to extract one more piece of truth from the fragments. Maybe the real revelation was that there was nothing to reveal, that the work itself, the albums, the performances, the interviews, was the truth, and looking for something beneath it was missing the point. Bowie had been showing everyone who he was for 50 years. The fact that who he was kept changing didn't make any version false, but that's not satisfying emotionally. People wanted the man beneath the masks, even though Bowie had spent his life suggesting there was no man, only masks. His death made that suggestion feel like deflection rather than philosophy. Surely there had to be a David Jones beneath David Bowie, and surely his death would grant access to that person. It didn't. Instead, his death became one final performance, one last piece of myth-making. The person disappeared, but the mythology expanded to fill the space he'd left, and in that expansion, every fragment of his archive became sacred, every silence became meaningful, every gap became an invitation to imagine what might have been said in the spaces between words. The period between 2016 and 2024 saw an unprecedented surge in Bowie archival discovery. His death had flipped a switch. Suddenly, everything related to him became valuable, not just commercially, though the market for Bowie memorabilia exploded, but culturally. Each scrap of footage, each discovered recording, each uncatalogued photograph became treated as archaeological evidence. States and museums mobilized. Private collectors opened their vaults. Fans with decades-old cassettes digitized their holdings. The effort was massive, decentralized, driven by collective understanding that analog media was disintegrating. If these materials weren't preserved now, they'd be lost forever. The David Bowie Years exhibition, which had started at the Victoria and Albert Museum in 2013, continued touring globally. It featured unreleased video interviews, backstage footage, costume designs, handwritten lyrics. Material that had been private became public, carefully curated by his estate and the museum. Some of the video interviews were revelatory. Bowie talking to costume designers about the meaning of specific outfits, discussing song lyrics with collaborators, explaining visual concepts for album covers. The footage showed his working process, methodical, collaborative, endlessly curious about details. But it also showed how controlled he was even in supposedly casual settings. Every conversation felt slightly performed. Even when discussing technical details about fabric or chord progressions, there was a layer of presentation. Bowie the person and Bowie the character had merged so completely that separation became impossible. In 2022, the Bowie estate announced they were digitizing 75,000 items for a permanent archive. Documents, recordings, videos, photographs. Everything would be catalogued, preserved, eventually made accessible to researchers and fans. It was an archival project on the scale usually reserved for museums or presidential libraries. The sheer volume was staggering. Most major artists accumulate maybe a few thousand items worth preserving. Bowie had 75,000. Every interview, every photo shoot, every sketch and note and contract. He'd kept almost everything, or at least his team had. The archive represented 50 years of professional output, all documented and saved. But the preservation raised ethical questions. Should everything be made public? Some recordings were clearly intended for private use. Rehearsals, personal phone calls, therapy sessions. Just because they existed didn't mean they should be available. The estate had to make judgment calls about consent and privacy, even for someone who could no longer consent. The BBC released previously unseen Q&A sessions from the 70s and 80s, raw footage that had been filed away for decades, considered too unpolished for broadcast. Bowie stumbling over answers, looking uncomfortable, breaking character in ways that humanised him, but also contradicted the carefully managed public image he'd maintained. Streaming platforms began hosting comprehensive collections. You could watch every television appearance chronologically, tracking how his face and voice changed across decades, how his interview style evolved from nervous and eager in the 60s to controlled and philosophical by the 2000s. The Forbidden label became marketing gold. Anything described as previously unreleased or long suppressed attracted immediate attention, even when the material itself was mundane. A recording of Bowie ordering lunch in German during the Berlin years got thousands of plays, simply because it hadn't been public before. There was leaked footage from 1995 to 96, the Earthling era, showing Bowie in a recording studio mocking his own fame, joking about how absurd it was to be treated as an icon when he felt like a fraud making it up as he went along. The humour was self-deprecating and uncomfortable. It didn't fit the mythologized version of Bowie as supremely confident artist, but that was exactly why it mattered. The archive was revealing complexity that simplified narratives couldn't accommodate. Bowie containing contradictions, confident and insecure, controlled and chaotic, calculated and spontaneous. All versions simultaneously true. Some material remained locked away. Recordings that were too personal, too unpolished, or legally complicated. Material featuring other people who hadn't consented to release. Phone calls with family members, therapy sessions. Some boundaries remained, even as many fell. The estate's approach was methodical. They weren't dumping everything into public access immediately. Each release was timed, contextualized, presented thoughtfully. This maintained some control over the mythology, even as they were opening the archive to unprecedented scrutiny. But it also meant continued speculation about what remained hidden. If 75,000 items were being catalogued, how many weren't? What had been destroyed, lost, or deemed too sensitive? The known archive was massive, but the unknown archive remained tantalizing. Fan communities developed sophisticated tracking systems, databases cross-referencing known recordings with documented interviews to identify gaps. If Bowie mentioned doing press in Tokyo in 1978, but no Japanese interview from that date existed in the archive, it got flagged as potentially missing material. Some missing pieces were found through these efforts. A fan would notice a reference to an interview, track down the broadcaster, discover the tape still existed in their archives, facilitate digitization. Crowdsourced archival work filling gaps the official process hadn't addressed yet. But other missing pieces stayed missing. Radio interviews recorded over for cost reasons, television appearances wiped by networks, physical items lost in moves or warehouse fires. Not everything survived. The archive had holes that could never be filled. The digital resurrection created strange temporal experiences. You could watch a 1974 interview, then a 2003 interview, then a 1987 interview, hopscotching through time in ways that dissolved chronology. Bowie at 30, 56 and 40 existed simultaneously, contradicting and complementing each other. This non-linear access changed how people understood his evolution. Instead of a clear narrative from beginning to end, it became a constellation of moments, connections formed across decades that wouldn't be visible if you'd only experienced his career chronologically. The archive became a choose-your-own-adventure through Bowie's life. You could trace specific themes, comments about art across 5 decades, or specific personas, every interview where he discussed Ziggy, or specific collaborators, every mention of Iggy Pop or Eno or Iman. The material allowed infinite paths through the same life, but this also created information overload. No single person could watch or listen to everything. The archive was too vast, so people specialised, becoming experts in specific eras or aspects. Communities formed around Berlin-era Bowie, or LA-era Bowie, or 90s Bowie. Each group developed their own interpretations based on different subsets of the total archive. The mythology fragmented as the archive expanded. Instead of one story about Bowie, there were thousands, each supported by different selections of evidence. And because the archive was so massive, almost any interpretation could find supporting material if you knew where to look. This might have been Bowie's final gift, or final prank. An archive so comprehensive and contradictory that it resisted singular interpretation. You could construct the Bowie you needed from the materials available, and so could everyone else, and none of those constructions would be more or less true than any other. The estate's controlled resurrection was working. Bowie remained relevant, discussed, analysed. New generations discovered his work through archival releases rather than radio play. The catalogue grew in value and cultural significance even as the person who created it remained absent. But the control also meant that lost material became more precious. Anything outside estate management, anything truly unauthorised, carried different weight. Bootlegs and unofficial recordings became valuable precisely because they weren't curated. They might contain truth that official releases had been sanitised to remove. This created a market for material the estate didn't want released. Bidding wars at auction houses for private recordings, leaked tapes circulating on file-sharing networks. The more comprehensive the official archive became, the more valuable the unofficial material became. And somewhere in that balance between revealed and hidden, public and private, official and bootleg, that's where Bowie's mythology continued to live and grow. The archive expanding but never complete. The story told but never finished. The person absent but somehow still managing his own image through what he'd left behind. Control. That's what it comes back to. Always. From the early 70s through his death, Bowie maintained extraordinary control over his public image. The kind of control most artists never achieve and probably shouldn't want, because it requires constant vigilance that edges into paranoia. He edited transcripts before publication, not just checking quotes for accuracy, actually rewriting them. Journalists would submit their articles before print, and Bowie would return them with changes. His quotes transformed from spontaneous responses into carefully crafted statements. Sometimes the rewritten version said the opposite of what he'd originally said. Most journalists went along with it because access to Bowie was valuable. But some bristled at the practice, feeling it violated the fundamental contract of journalism. You're supposed to report what someone said, not what they wish they'd said after having time to reconsider. Bowie didn't care about those concerns. He saw interviews as collaboration, not journalism. The reporter asked questions, he gave answers, then they worked together to create the final text. That the reporter might not see it as collaboration was their problem, not his. His PR team confirmed he had veto power over certain segments. Television appearances could be filmed but not broadcast without approval. Radio interviews could be conducted but shelved if he changed his mind. The level of control was unusual even for major artists, but Bowie had the leverage to demand it. This control birthed myths about banned or censored interviews. When something didn't air, people assumed conspiracy rather than artist prerogative. The reality was often simpler. Bowie watched the footage, decided he didn't like how he'd come across, and exercised his contractual right to kill the segment. But why would an artist suppress their own interview? Usually because it revealed too much, or revealed the wrong things, showed him tired when he wanted to project energy, showed him uncertain when he wanted to project confidence, showed the machinery of construction when he wanted to present finished product. In a 1998 interview he later pulled from circulation, Bowie apparently discussed his fear of obsolescence in startlingly direct terms, how he felt like his innovations had been absorbed by younger artists who did them better, how he worried his relevance was purely nostalgic. The interview was honest in ways that contradicted his public image of timeless cool. He blocked its release. Not officially, he just didn't sign off on broadcast, and his contract gave him that power. The footage exists somewhere in a network archive, but it's never aired. The interviewer mentioned it years later in a blog post, describing Bowie's candour and subsequent retraction. This pattern repeated across decades. Moments of vulnerability followed by suppression. The vulnerability was real. Bowie genuinely opened up to certain interviewers, but the suppression was also real. He'd reveal himself, then decide that revelation was tactical error, and deploy his contractual control to undo it. The result was an archive carefully curated to present specific versions of himself, confident, articulate, mysterious. The messier, more human moments got removed before they could complicate the mythology. What the public saw was Bowie's highlight reel, not the full footage. Scholars now treat his interviews as performances rather than confessions. They're studied like scripted material because that's effectively what they are. Even spontaneous answers were subject to later revision, which means you can't trust them as documentation of in-the-moment thought. But here's what makes it complicated. The revision itself is documentation. Seeing what Bowie changed tells you something real about his priorities, his insecurities, his understanding of his public image. The edited transcript is more revealing than the original in some ways, because it shows what he thought needed protecting. A quote often attributed to Bowie: "Never explain anything. It kills the magic." Whether he actually said this is debatable. It appears in multiple sources but always without specific citation. It might be apocryphal. But it accurately reflects his philosophy toward public explanation. He preferred mystery to clarity, ambiguity to definition, questions to answers, not because he didn't have answers, but because answers closed down interpretation. They limited how his work could be understood. Mystery kept everything open, alive, perpetually in motion. This extended beyond interviews to his entire public presence. He rarely explained what songs meant. He'd give cryptic hints but resist explicit interpretation. When pressed, he'd give answers that contradicted previous answers, destabilizing any attempt at definitive reading. The estate has continued this policy posthumously. They've been selective about what gets released and how it's contextualized. Some material remains private. Some requests for access get denied. The control extends beyond death, enacted by people Bowie trusted to manage his mythology. This raises questions about ownership. Does the work belong to the artist or the audience once it's released? Bowie clearly believed artists retained ownership perpetually, including control over legacy and interpretation. But others argue that public art becomes public property, and excessive control limits cultural value. Legally, the estate has rights. Ethically, it's more complex. Bowie's wish for privacy around certain material competes with historical interest in comprehensive documentation. Where's the line between respecting an artist's wishes and serving scholarship and public interest? The estate has mostly erred toward restriction. Better to release too little than too much, maintain scarcity, preserve mystique. It's consistent with how Bowie managed his image while living, the same principles operating through different agents, but this means material exists that might never be public. Recordings locked away permanently, interviews that will remain eternally lost not through accident but by design. The forbidden material that fans speculate about is sometimes literally forbidden, consciously withheld, not accidentally misplaced. The control worked for Bowie. His mythology remained intact through death and beyond. The image he constructed held up under scrutiny, because he'd carefully controlled what could be scrutinized. The architecture was sound because he'd removed all the supporting beams that showed the structure. But there's something sad about it too. The level of control suggests deep insecurity. A person truly confident in themselves wouldn't need to manage every detail of their presentation. The performance of confidence required constant maintenance, constant vigilance, constant editing. Maybe that's the real revelation buried in the controlled archive. Not what Bowie said, but what he felt compelled to suppress. The negative space around his public image revealing more than the image itself. What needed protecting tells you what felt vulnerable. His silence was strategic art. Each unsaid thing, each suppressed interview, each edited transcript was a choice, and choices reveal priorities. By mapping what Bowie removed from public view, you could construct an inverse portrait, an image made from absences showing precisely what he didn't want seen. That portrait would show someone brilliant and fragile. Someone who created extraordinary art but never quite believed it was good enough. Someone who performed confidence while feeling perpetual imposter syndrome. Someone who constructed personas to hide but ended up trapped inside them. This version of Bowie doesn't appear in the official archive. You have to read between the lines, track the suppressions, notice the patterns in what's missing. But it's there, invisible, but detectable, like dark matter inferred through gravitational effects. The interviews that were never wanted released aren't necessarily the most revealing in their content. They're revealing in their suppression. The fact that Bowie felt they needed to be hidden tells you something his public statements never could. And so the mythology continues, built as much from absence as presence. The lost interviews matter not because of what they contain, but because they're lost. The forbidden material is valuable precisely because it's forbidden. The control itself became part of the art. Bowie understood this. He knew that what you withhold shapes how what you reveal gets interpreted. That silence isn't emptiness, it's a form of communication. That absence can be more eloquent than presence if wielded intentionally. His final performance was disappearing while remaining visible, controlling his mythology from beyond death, speaking through strategic silence, remaining unknowable despite vast documentation. It was maybe his most successful piece of conceptual art, an archive so comprehensive yet so controlled that it answered everything while explaining nothing. The lost interviews exist. They're in vaults, on forgotten tapes, in estate-controlled collections, but they'll remain lost because loss is more powerful than discovery. The mythology needs mystery to survive, and Bowie, even in death, remains the most effective manager of his own mystery. The internet has a problem with absence. Everything should be accessible, preserved, downloadable. Lost material is a challenge to be overcome through crowdsourced effort. If something existed once, it should be findable now. Anything less feels like failure. So fans began reconstructing forbidden versions of Bowie interviews, projects that spliced together existing fragments, reordered quotes, added context from other sources to create something that felt complete, even if it wasn't real. They called these fan edits or reconstructions, acknowledging they were approximations rather than originals. Some efforts were straightforward. If an interview existed in audio but not video, fans would create video using still photographs synced to the sound. If a transcript existed but no recording, people would create animated versions with text-to-speech approximating Bowie's voice. But other projects went further. They used existing audio to construct interviews that had never happened, taking Bowie's voice from various sources, editing together new responses, creating conversations about topics he'd never actually discussed. The technology improved over time. Early versions sounded obviously fake. Later versions were eerily convincing. The 2018 project called the DB77 Mix became controversial in fan communities. It combined real audio from Berlin-era interviews with AI-generated voice synthesis to create missing segments. The creator was transparent about methodology. This was speculation made tangible, not actual archival discovery. But as it circulated, context got stripped away. People began treating it as real. This raised uncomfortable questions. When does homage become misinformation? If you create something that sounds real and admit it's fake, but then it gets shared without that context, are you responsible for the deception? Where's the line between creative interpretation and fraudulent documentation? Bowie himself had used cut-up methods inspired by William S. Burroughs, taking text, slicing it apart, rearranging into new meaning. His lyrics often emerge from this process, words that had context in their original sources getting deconstructed and rebuilt into something new. meaning generated through recombination rather than linear composition. Fans doing the same thing with his interviews were following his methodology, taking his actual words, rearranging them, creating new statements that had different meaning in new configurations. It was collaborative art in the tradition Bowie himself had pioneered, except it was also potentially deceptive, because audio and video carry authority that text doesn't. When you hear Bowie's voice saying something, you assume he said it. Even if the words were edited together from different sources, even if the context has been completely fabricated, the voice reads as authentic. Some fan reconstructions were clearly labelled as such. They lived in the tradition of remix and mashup culture, acknowledged as derivative work. But others circulated without clear attribution, especially once they'd been shared a few times across social media. The original creator's disclaimer got lost, and what remained seemed like archival discovery. YouTube was full of videos titled things like David Bowie, Lost Interview 1977, rediscovered. Some were real, actual recordings that had been digitized and uploaded, but others were reconstructions, cobbled together from multiple sources, sometimes including generated content. Telling them apart required expertise most viewers didn't have. Media literacy became crucial. How do you evaluate source authenticity when technology makes fakes increasingly convincing? The traditional markers, image quality, audio fidelity, no longer worked as reliable indicators. Degraded quality could mean authentic analog source, or deliberate aging to make fake material seem archival. The interview they never wanted released became a self-fulfilling prophecy through this process. People wanted so badly for a definitive lost interview to exist that they created one. Not maliciously, usually with clear intentions to engage with Bowie's work creatively. But the circulation dynamics of the internet meant creative work could become confused with historical record. Wikipedia editors battled constantly with people trying to add fan reconstructions as legitimate sources. The talk pages for Bowie-related articles were full of debates about what constituted reliable documentation. Audio that clearly existed, but without verifiable chain of custody or publication history, how should that be treated? Bowie's influence extending even here. His entire artistic practice had been about manipulating truth and identity. His personas were real in that they existed and did things in the world, but fictional in that they were conscious constructions. His fans, continuing that tradition, creating new Bowies that existed in the ambiguous space between real and imagined. But there were real consequences. Researchers citing fake interviews in academic papers. Journalists referencing reconstructed quotes as if they were genuine. The line between collaborative mythology and misinformation was genuinely hard to locate. Some argued this was fine, that mythology has always been collaborative. That Homer didn't write the Odyssey alone. Generations of tellers shaped it. Bowie's mythology was the same. His actual words and work were source material, but the culture surrounding him was creating meaning collectively. Others argued this was dangerous, that truth matters, especially historical truth, that letting fake material contaminate the archive serves no one, that there's difference between interpretation and fabrication, and that difference needs protection. Both positions had merit. The tension was probably irresolvable. Digital tools made manipulation easy, while distribution networks made controlling narratives impossible. The result was an ecosystem where real and reconstructed existed side by side, often indistinguishable without serious investigation. Bowie might have appreciated the chaos. His art had always been about the instability of identity and truth, about how performance and authenticity blend until separation becomes arbitrary. Watching his audience create new versions of him that may or may not be real seems entirely consistent with his aesthetic, but it also meant the historical record was genuinely compromised. Future researchers would need to approach all Bowie material with skepticism, knowing that some percentage was reconstruction. The archive couldn't be trusted completely, which made studying it harder but maybe more interesting. Fan communities developed their own authentication practices. Senior members who'd been collecting since the 70s, who'd traded tapes through mail for decades, became arbiters of legitimacy. They could spot fake material through familiarity with authentic sources. But as that generation aged, their knowledge became increasingly uncatalogued and at risk of being lost. The mythology sustained itself through these reconstruction efforts, even as it became less historically accurate. New stories emerged about lost interviews, based partly on real gaps in the record and partly on collective desire for those gaps to be filled. The need for comprehensive documentation creating pressure that manifested as creative fabrication. Bowie had spent his life blurring lines between truth and fiction. His audience learned from him, then applied those lessons back to him, creating a feedback loop where the person who taught them to question authenticity became subject to that same questioning. The student honouring the teacher by using his methods against him. Maybe that's the real legacy. Not the albums or performances, though those matter, but the epistemological uncertainty. The way Bowie made everyone who engaged with his work less certain about the stability of identity and truth, how he trained his audience to see performance everywhere, then became their subject. The reconstructed interviews, the fan edits, the ambiguously authentic recordings, they're all continuation of Bowie's artistic project. Intentional or not, they extend his exploration of how identity gets constructed, performed, documented, and remembered. The archive becomes active rather than static, constantly regenerating itself through collective engagement. But it also means that finding the truth becomes nearly impossible. Too many layers, too much reconstruction, too many motivated interpretations. The Bowie who existed as flesh and blood increasingly obscured by the Bowie who exists as cultural text. And that textual Bowie is now collaborative, created as much by fans as by the person himself. The irony is that this might be the most honest version, because Bowie always was collaborative. The personas didn't exist until audiences believed in them. Ziggy Stardust needed people treating him as alien for the alienness to be real. The art required audience participation to complete itself, so the reconstructed interviews, even when fake, participate in the same creative process that made Bowie's work possible in the first place. They're just continuing the collaboration past his death, with technology providing new tools for the same essential activity. Whether that's beautiful or tragic depends on your relationship to truth. If truth is fixed and discoverable, it's tragic, the record being corrupted. If truth is constructed and collaborative, it's beautiful, the work continuing past death. Bowie probably believed something closer to the latter, which means the fan reconstructions are maybe the tribute he'd have appreciated most. The line blurs until it disappears. Real interviews become legendary. Reconstructed interviews become historical. And somewhere in that ambiguity, Bowie's actual voice and persona continue to exist, speaking words he may or may not have said, being the person he may or may not have been, forever. Should everything an artist says be public? The question would have seemed absurd 50 years ago. Privacy was default. Preservation was expensive. Most casual conversations disappeared simply because no one was recording them. But we live in different conditions now. Everything can be recorded. Storage costs nothing. Archival completeness is technically achievable, which forces a question that previous generations didn't have to answer. Just because we can preserve everything, does that mean we should? Bowie's posthumous publishing history raises this sharply. His candid interviews often revealed private philosophies, personal struggles, thoughts he'd shared in moments of vulnerability. Publishing them after death blurs the lines of consent in uncomfortable ways. While living, Bowie could approve or suppress material, could decide what fit his public image and what needed to remain private. Death removed that agency. Now others make those decisions. His estate, archivists, publishers, broadcasters. They're trying to honour his wishes, but they're also making judgment calls about material he never explicitly approved or forbade. There's a tension between Bowie's well-documented love of control and his occasional embrace of vulnerability. Some interviews show him genuinely open, speaking from a place of unguarded honesty. Did he consent to that openness remaining public permanently? Or did he trust certain interviewers in specific moments, assuming the material would have limited circulation? The posthumous context changes meaning. An interview that felt safe in 1993 might feel exploitative in 2024, after his death, when he can't respond to or contextualize what was said. The power dynamic shifts entirely. He can't defend himself against misinterpretation or clarify statements that read differently 3 decades later. Recent debates about AI recreations of deceased artists make this even more complex. Companies creating virtual versions of dead musicians to perform new material. fans using deepfake technology to generate new content featuring performers who never consented. The technology making it possible to recreate someone's voice, face, likeness with disturbing accuracy. Bowie himself commented on this, sort of years before the technology existed in its current form. In a 1999 interview, "When I'm dead, I hope they don't use me to sell socks." It was a joke, but it captured his awareness that death would end his control, that his image would become property to be managed by others, and not necessarily in ways he'd approve. His estate has been protective, which seems consistent with his wishes. They've blocked certain commercial uses. They've been selective about endorsements and licensing. They've maintained quality standards for official releases. In this sense, they're continuing the control Bowie exercised while living. But they've also published material Bowie never approved for release, interviews he didn't sign off on, behind-the-scenes footage he may not have wanted public. The decisions are made with good intentions, historical preservation, fan service, maintaining relevance, but they're still decisions he didn't make himself. The tension between legacy and intrusion defines modern posthumous publishing. Audiences crave access, complete archives, comprehensive documentation, every scrap of footage and recording. But that completeness comes at the cost of privacy and consent. Would Bowie have approved of the extensive archival releases? Probably some yes, some no. He was complicated about his past work, proud of some, embarrassed by other parts, ambivalent about most. He might have wanted certain Berlin-era material released. He definitely would have suppressed some Ziggy-era footage. Making blanket statements about his wishes is impossible. His willingness to share often depended on context and timing. Material he'd suppress in 1985 he might release in 2003, once enough time had passed for it to feel like history rather than raw exposure. But death freezes that process. The estate has to guess what future Bowie would have decided, which is impossible. Some argue that artists lose privacy rights after death, that they become historical figures, and history requires complete documentation regardless of personal preference. That public interest in comprehensive archives outweighs individual desire for privacy. Others argue that privacy extends beyond death, that just because someone was famous doesn't mean every aspect of their life should be public. That dignity and consent matter even when someone can't enforce their own boundaries. Bowie's case is complicated because he was so aware of his public image. He spent 50 years actively managing it. His death meant losing that management, which feels like fundamental violation of his life's work. The control was the art in many ways. Removing it retroactively changes what his career meant. The estate tries to balance competing interests, preserve historical record, respect Bowie's privacy, satisfy audience demand, maintain commercial value, prevent misinformation. These goals sometimes conflict. A recording might be historically important but personally embarrassing. Footage might satisfy fans but contradict the image Bowie spent decades constructing. Who decides which value takes priority? Currently it's his wife and designated executors. They're making choices based on their understanding of his wishes, their sense of what's appropriate, their need to manage the estate effectively. But they're making choices he didn't make, which means his agency has been transferred to others. Is that acceptable? Maybe inevitably so. Death always involves loss of control. Estates always make posthumous decisions artists can't oversee. The alternative, destroying all unreleased material to ensure it stays private, seems worse than selective publishing. But selective publishing means someone's judgment determines what gets seen. And judgment is subjective, shaped by contemporary values, commercial pressures, personal relationships to the deceased. The Bowie who emerges from posthumous releases is shaped by these external forces, not just by who he actually was. This creates a strange situation where Bowie's image is simultaneously more fixed and more mutable than during life. Fixed because he can't change it anymore. Mutable because others can emphasize different aspects through selective release. The archive becoming clay to be shaped by curators rather than the artist himself. Some fans argue that any release is better than suppression, that historical completeness requires accepting some discomfort, that Bowie's work belongs to culture now, not just to his estate, that preserving everything serves scholarship and public memory. But completeness has costs. The right to be forgotten exists for a reason. Even public figures deserve privacy about some things. Where's the line between historical record and voyeurism? Between legitimate scholarship and tabloid intrusion? The interview format specifically raises these questions because interviews feel confessional. Someone speaking directly, seemingly without mediation. Even though Bowie treated interviews as performance, audiences hear them as authentic expression. Publishing them posthumously without his approval feels invasive in ways that releasing unfinished music might not. Maybe the solution is transparency, clearly marking what was approved versus what's archival release, providing context about conditions of creation, letting audiences know when material is being published without the artist's explicit consent. That way, people can make informed judgments about what weight to give different sources. But transparency doesn't solve the fundamental problem, which is that death ends agency, and posthumous publishing always involves others making decisions for someone who can't speak for themselves. The best intentions can't change that basic fact. Bowie's own ambivalence about his archive makes this harder. He saved things, which suggests he wanted them preserved. But he also suppressed things, which suggests he wanted control over what was public. Reading intention from those contradictory impulses is difficult. Maybe the real question isn't whether everything should be published, but whether the desire for completeness serves anyone beyond satisfying curiosity. Does comprehensive documentation actually honour an artist? Or does it violate the artistic choice to leave things unsaid? Bowie's art was often about what wasn't shown. The gaps between personas, the silence between albums, the mystery that came from withholding. Filling those gaps posthumously might complete the historical record, but it damages the aesthetic that made his work powerful. The interview that exists but stays private might be more valuable remaining private. Its existence, known but inaccessible, serves the mythology better than its release would. Because the mythology needs mystery, and mystery requires some things staying unknown. That's unsatisfying for archivists and fans. The drive to document completely, to leave no stone unturned, to make everything accessible. But maybe that drive is fundamentally opposed to art that depends on absence and ambiguity. Maybe the ethics of resurrection require accepting incompleteness, admitting some things should stay buried, honouring an artist's right to privacy even after death, even when that means the historical record has permanent gaps. The alternative, total exposure, complete documentation, no mystery remaining, might preserve more material, but it would betray the essential quality of Bowie's work, which was always about what he chose not to reveal as much as what he showed. The performance included silence, and silence once broken can't be restored. The story starts with sound, or rather, the absence of it. Somewhere in a basement there's a tape that shouldn't exist anymore. People talk about it the way they talk about ghosts, half believing, half inventing, fully obsessed. They call it the interview Bowie buried. Except here's the thing, there isn't just one lost interview. There are dozens, maybe hundreds. The phrase, lost Bowie interview, has circulated since the early 1980s, whispered like a password. Sometimes it refers to real missing reels that vanished during studio moves. Sometimes it means damaged tapes, the magnetic oxide flaking off like skin. And sometimes it means nothing at all, just collective wish that somewhere Bowie said something true. The legend grows because Bowie was so good at controlling what you heard. Every public appearance was theatre. You'd walk away feeling like you'd learned something profound, then realise you couldn't remember a single concrete thing he'd said. Several interviews from different eras became mythical through disappearance. Paul Dunoyer's 1989 conversation sat unpublished for years. Vinnie Seltzer's 1993 radio interview was thought lost until someone uploaded it to SoundCloud. CBS filmed Bowie in 2003 for 60 minutes, then shelved it for 13 years. It finally aired days after his death in 2016, transforming from pleasant retrospective to message from beyond. But most lost material wasn't suppressed, it was just forgotten. RCA promotional interviews from 1973-75 vanished during corporate mergers. Label archivists confirmed missing Diamond Dog's press reels. The material existed, was created, was stored, then disappeared through institutional indifference. Storage costs money. Proper cataloguing takes time. So after a certain period, if material hadn't been accessed, it got junked. The decision to throw out old press reels saved the company $50 monthly. The cost to cultural history was incalculable, but wasn't factored in. This is how most lost material actually disappears. Not through dramatic suppression, but through mundane cost-benefit calculations. Conspiracy is more satisfying than the incompetence. But most was lost through the latter. Bowie himself maintained extraordinary control while living. He edited transcripts before publication, not checking quotes for accuracy, but actually rewriting them. Sometimes the rewritten version said the opposite of what he'd originally said. His PR team confirmed he had veto power over segments. Television appearances could be filmed but not broadcast without approval. This control birthed myths about banned interviews. When something didn't air, people assumed conspiracy rather than artist prerogative. Usually Bowie just watched footage, decided he didn't like how he'd come across, and exercised his contractual right to kill it. Quote often attributed to Bowie, "Never explain anything, it kills the magic." Whether he actually said this is debatable, but it reflects his philosophy. He preferred mystery to clarity, questions to answers, not because he didn't have answers, but because answers closed down interpretation. The internet created new complications. Fans began reconstructing forbidden versions, splicing together fragments, using AI to generate missing segments. The 2018 DB77 mix combined real audio with synthesized voice to create lost material. When does homage become misinformation? Bowie had used cut-up methods himself, taking text and rearranging into new meaning. His fans were following his methodology, but audio carries authority, text doesn't. Meanwhile, the official archive expanded. His estate announced digitizing 75,000 items. The David Bowie Is exhibition featured unreleased video interviews. BBC released previously unseen footage. Each discovery prompted new questions about what else remained hidden. But comprehensive documentation raised ethical concerns. Should everything an artist said be public? Bowie's candid interviews revealed private philosophies. Publishing them after death blurs consent. He could approve or suppress material while living. Death removed that agency. His estate tries to honour his wishes, but they're making choices he never made himself. Bowie foresaw his posthumous mythology with unsettling clarity. Black Star, released 2 days before his death, functioned as coded farewell, the lyrics suddenly legible as meditation on mortality. But was it direct, or was directness another layer of performance? Both readings are probably true simultaneously. He left no autobiography, no memoir explaining his choices. Instead, he left fragments, interviews scattered across decades, many contradicting each other. The absence of singular narrative was itself a statement. His final performance was teaching us to accept irresolution, to live with mystery, to understand some questions don't have answers, and that's okay. The album ends with "I Can't Give Everything Away," the title itself instruction, a reminder that withholding is legitimate, that not everything needs sharing or explanation. The last line he sings, "I know something is very wrong." He doesn't explain. He just states the feeling, then stops. Days later, he was dead. The silence became permanent. And the work of interpretation continues indefinitely, because that's how mythology functions. What remains unheard, that's the real subject. The lost interview is collective fiction. Not one recording, but thousands of moments no one documented. Or documented then lost, or kept private deliberately. The gaps between what was said and what was recorded. Between what was recorded and what survived. Bowie built his career on those gaps. The space between personas, the silence between albums, mystery generated through strategic absence. Every rediscovered interview fills one gap while revealing others. The archive is fractal. Zoom in on any fragment and new absences appear. The legend persists because Bowie built his life around the edge of truth. Never quite lying, never quite honest. Always performing, but performing what? The layers never resolve into singular reality. The interview they never wanted released might be your imagination filling gaps. Your need for definitive statement projected onto silence. Your desire for closure encountering an artist whose entire aesthetic was open-endedness. His real 1999 quote, I'm quite happy to be an enigma. It's what I do best. The statement isn't enigmatic, it's clear. He's telling you exactly what he's doing. The enigma is strategy, not accident.